What's it like being black in Russia? Went to Russia for band class while in high school, and there was only one black kid in my class. A lot of random people would come up and ask to take a picture with him. As a mixed-race American tourist in Russia, only St. Petersburg and Moscow, circa 1994, it was fine. Probably didn't hurt that I was able to speak and read a bit of Russian at the time. I find that being an American who has learned at least 5 words of the local language generally stands out in a good way almost anywhere, except Paris, of course. I do remember finding myself near a group of black, clearly of much more recent African descent than myself, Russians, and wanting to smack myself for being surprised that they were speaking to each other in Russian of all things. Soviet Russia did admire at least one black man, Paul Robeson, and then named an heirloom tomato after him, because it's brown. I guess it was meant as a high praise, but Girlfriend is from Russia and says that it's likely you'll be stared at like a zoo specimen. I also remember her relating a story where her grandmother had referred to her previous boyfriend, a man of African heritage, as her chocolate man. So, Russia, not the most progressive place. Being in Moscow for 20 days back in 2013, you're basically an extraterrestrial. People will poke one another to look at you. They will want to take pictures, touch your hair, and stare at you 24/7. As a male, girls will swoon and boys will hate you and say things like, "Russia is for the Russians." I believe that the opposite might be true for females. I had a whole metro car of people staring at me once when I entered, and it made me feel very uncomfortable and very conscious at the time. I could not blend into the crowd and just admire the city. But besides that, everyone was polite and treated me normally. When engaged, the city is very beautiful, and there are tons of things to see and do there. I would like to visit it again. There's a black guy on YouTube who's in Russia. He said, "I have friends here, but I could be killed tomorrow," adding, "Don't come here if you're black." I can give a close enough answer. Serbia, also a Slavic 100% white Orthodox Christian country. The only permanent resident blacks we have here, mere hundreds in a country of 7 million, are usually students from African countries. Others are tourists. We view blacks as kind of a curiosity. If you come here, definitely be ready for looks in public transport, on the street, etc. Not hateful looks, but "Hey, look, a black man" looks. Like when a white guy goes to some black tribe in the middle of Africa. Also, if you're a black man, some girls will give you the "is it true what they say" look. If you're a black girl, you will probably be hit on by Serbian guys because doing the black girl is an achievement akin to finding a holy grail or something. Everyone who goes abroad for vacation swears that he fucked a black girl. Most of this sounds racist, but none of it is in bad intentions. As I said, it's simple curiosity. It's exotic. Other than said things, no one will do anything to them, nor insult them, nor discriminate them. In some cases, quite contrary, they see you're a foreigner, so they will serve you faster in a restaurant, etc. Of course, I'm talking about broad population. We do have fringe Nazi groups like any other nation. Paradoxical, since Nazis genocided the fuck out of us back then. But they're not the point in this comment. I lived in Russia from the time I turned 2 until I turned 17. I went to a famous ballet school, don't want to give up my identity, and danced ballet professionally. I spoke fluent Russian, Estonian, and English. I lived between Moscow and St. Petersburg, and I would leave in the summers to go travel Europe. I was always extremely comfortable in Russia. I'm a woman, and I was only ever treated with the utmost respect. I could use public transportation at any time, and I was often more comfortable in Russia than when I'd visit home in America or England. There were many perks. I stood out to people, and so I could go into museums and go sightseeing for free. I got a lot of ballet roles and danced at the Mariinsky. I had lots of friends. I was always comfortable. Men loved me, women loved me. I had a position of power. This being said, I was never allowed to openly date. My nan was always wary of the older Russian men that had their eyes on the chocolate princess. She didn't want me to make anyone mad and disappear. I did have a long-term boyfriend on the low. It depends on what you make of it. If you know the language or are willing to learn, stay in safe places and go out and attempt to befriend the locals. Russia isn't too bad, but you always have to watch yourself because situations turn fast in the former USSR. This reminded me of a joke. During Cold War, a prospective CIA operative was studying everything about Russia, its culture, language, history, you name it. He became so well versed that he could pass for a Russian or Soviet. So off he flies to Moscow to start his mission. First day on the field, he decides to test his language skills with the local population. He approaches an elderly and in flawless Russian asks about the time. The elderly responds, "Sure, Mr. American. Time is..." Mystified on how this old Russian found he was American, the guy decides to ask several other people around, getting the response, "Sure, Mr. American." Finally, fed up, he decides to ask a policeman how the hell the people would deduce he was American. The policeman politely says to him, "Well, Mr. America, you are black." I'm not white, nor am I black. However, I studied, worked, and lived in Moscow for over a year. I dated a Russian woman, and upon meeting her friends, they all assumed I was black. They were shocked to hear that I didn't consider myself black. My experience made me feel that Russians consider most brown people to be black. Casual racism is the norm in Russia. You know, things like, "I don't have anything against black people, but mixed marriages shouldn't exist." Plenty of people who are very openly racist. Black people are viewed as the others. I lived in Chelyabinsk for a short while and knew a few black guys who taught English, French there. I've heard that some people were racist but never seen anything more than "look, a black guy" looks from locals when I would spend time with them. Racial memes are somewhat popular among young people, mostly relatively light-hearted ones. Black people steal, but once in a while you can see legit hatred. We have our own far right after all, not just conservatives but real extremists. They hate Putin for being too moderate for their liking. It's a fringe minority though. Most people are indifferent and see black people as something exotic. When I was a student back in 1990s, there were some areas in the city that black or Asian students tried to avoid. But since neo-Nazi and skinhead groups were strictly banned in 2000s, the situation is better now. I have a class of African students and they don't complain. But I'm sure that not every family here would be happy if their child would marry a black person. Not because of pure racism, but because of cultural difference as well. We are neither saints nor devils. It's not like we hold some moral high ground or occupy the bottom of it. We have own good people and own jerks. Just as we have own prejudices that are held by different shares of people, depending on the prejudice you pick. As for black people, we just have never had enough of them to build any common prejudice. So the most common attitude a black person is going to meet in Russia is definitely a foreigner, must be a tourist, or an exchange student, or something like that. Probably a lot of impolitely curious looks, like an albino person would meet. Then again, jerks exist and I don't think there is a place on earth one is 100% protected from being disliked by someone for no reason. But let's say a black person in some random bar in Russia had an infinitely higher probability of being annoyed by some, "Aha, I've never met a foreigner, so I'm going to buy the guy a drink and hopefully practice my English," drunk than, "Aha, I'm going to tell the guy I don't like him, so he should GTFO," drunk. Whatever racism there is in Russia, I don't think it applies to actual black people. Unlike some other immigrants, black people are usually polite to strangers and respectful of people around them. Most of the black people I've seen here were exchange students, and we have a lot of them, particularly in my vicinity. They're pretty cool. Some of them even work for local services, seen several working in our local Burger King and one in a local food delivery service, and they're miles better at providing a quality service than most of the Russians. I don't know. Black people here are cool. It might be different elsewhere in Russia though, just speaking from my personal experience. I'm a Nigerian and a student in Russia. I heard a lot of stories about racism in Russia and it being the headquarters of racial discriminations before I came to Russia. But I've been here for 3 years still waiting to experience racism. Like I have Russian friends and they've helped me a lot in my academic journey and we do go out and stuff. I'm not saying there's no racism in Russia because I actually have a friend in Moscow that told me how he experienced it, but it is not as how people outside make it up to be. Russia is devoid of Western social tension between skin color. For the most part, blacks are considered exotic, especially in the interior villages. That is, do not be surprised that children will run after you and point fingers in the Russian outback. The same thing happens in Africa with whites. And so, we do not have systemic racism. You can safely work and get an education if you have the knowledge and skills for this. There are some subtleties in communicating with people. Many Russians can call you the word N without investing in this insult or racist meaning. Russians are taught this way in schools. Also, if you are not warmly dressed in winter, I advise you to stay away from grandmothers. You will be surrounded and reprimanded that black people need to dress warmer in winter. This is not Africa for you. Many reports of racism in Russia come from misunderstandings. In Chelyabinsk, at least there's quite a lot of black people, especially around Teplotech, if anyone's from here too. They cool. Also, it's kinda no different if you meet a Caucasian, Georgian, Armenian, etc., Central Asian, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, or Black. Russia is a very ethnically diverse country, and we get used to it. Not all of us, though. I've spent a bit of time with Black people during my time in university, and they were, in general, very polite in public and pretty open and friendly in their own circles of friends, both whites and blacks. None of them minded if they were called the N-word, cause they called us names too, so we just made fun of each other on friendly terms. I still talk with a few of them from time to time. Some of them decided to stay here, some returned to their countries. Those who stayed are employed, construction, delivery, engineers. In Far East, people usually get curious and might stare a bit, just because it's a rare sight. Where I'm from, we have exchange students from Eritrea and Angola. They serve at Far Eastern Higher Combined Arms Command School. They're always polite and are treated accordingly. Personally, I feel like we just don't have the same view on race relationships as some people in the West do. With us, it's more about nationality and way less about skin color. You should see and hear all those Obama jokes, which to me reflects their general attitude towards Black people. Black people to them are someone who just climbed down from the palm tree or on its way to a plantation. As long as Black people don't bother them or do things the way that agree with Russians, they are okay. Otherwise, you hear all that. That's the general attitude. Edit. Perhaps the younger group of this subreddit that is more educated and comes from larger cities doesn't see it this way, but the vast majority of the Russians do. I'm Russian and I'll be honest, I think that it doesn't matter what color a person is. The main thing is that a person be normal. Blacks in Russia, usually high school students. They're smart, intelligent people. No reason to hate them in common. In other hand, in Russia, a lot of low-salary workers from Middle Asia. For better life, much of them do not hesitate for crimes. So in Russia, many racist, but against people from Middle Asia. There are very few Black people here. I have only seen 2 Black people in my life so far. Most of them are guest workers. I don't treat them any different from other people I come across. If you do not explain in Russia how to live or what to do if no one asks you. If you do not try to place in head of people propaganda, religion, ideology, and liberal trash. If just live, work, grow, children, chill, and do not harm people, no one care how you look.